Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the thing you've spent your entire life chasing, the dream you thought would finally complete you, hasn't brought you any closer to meaning. That after years of struggle, sacrifice, and self-branding, you're not fulfilled. You're exhausted, not free, just more entangled in your own expectations. You were told, follow your passion and you'll never work a day in your life. But no one told you what to do when your passion begins to feel like labor. When the thing you once loved becomes a performance. When your identity is so fused with your calling that failure doesn't feel like a setback, feels like death. Passion was supposed to be a compass. Instead, it became a leash. There's a quiet despair that comes with chasing passion like it's a moral duty, a kind of suffering masked as ambition. You scroll past stories of the 22-year-old entrepreneur who made 7 figures from their childhood hobby and wonder, what's wrong with me? Why hasn't it clicked for me yet? You search for that one true thing you were born to do, and if you haven't found it, you assume you're broken, lazy, uninspired. You work harder, you take courses, you meditate, you journal, you rebrand yourself again and again, but the emptiness persists. The tragedy isn't that we haven't found our passion. It's that we've been convinced it's hiding from us, like a soulmate we must seduce, or a treasure we must earn the right to unearth. But what if this isn't a personal failing? What if the very idea of following your passion is a trap? Seductive lie dressed up as freedom. What if this modern gospel, repeated in TED Talks and Instagram quotes, is less about liberation and more about control, an invisible force shaping how we see success, identity, and even love? Because here's the paradox. When passion becomes your North Star, your value becomes conditional. Conditional on output, on results, on being good enough to earn a life worth living. And when passion turns into pressure, into performance, into perfectionism, it stops being yours. It becomes a contract, a currency. But who wrote the terms? Who decided that you must earn your purpose? Who told you that your life only has meaning if you turn what you love into a product? Can something still be sacred if you monetize it? Can something still be joyful if it's measured in metrics? Or are we turning our inner fire into content, repackaging our souls for algorithms and applause? There is a reason this narrative feels so heavy, so personal. It touches something primal, the human need to feel chosen, special, irreplaceable. Follow your passion whispers that if you just dig deep enough, you'll uncover the secret, blueprint for your life. But what if there is no blueprint? What if passion isn't something you find, but something you create? Or, better yet, what if you don't need a passion to live a meaningful life at all? We are raised to believe that meaning is hidden, buried, locked away behind self-discovery quests and entrepreneurial grit. But Schopenhauer once suggested that the will for inner drive can be a cruel tyrant. That desire, when unchecked, only breeds more desire, and perhaps passion, when mistaken for destiny, does the same. It lures us into believing we are in control, while binding us to a lifelong chase for something that was never lost to begin with. So ask yourself, do you love the thing itself? Or do you love the version of yourself it promises to make you? Do you write because you must, or because you were told you were the creative type? Do you sing, paint, build, dance, speak, code, or dream because it sets your soul on fire? Because the world said, this is the fire that makes you worthy. And if the applause stopped, if no one was watching, would you still do it? Because maybe the real question isn't, what's my passion? Maybe the real question is, who am I when I stop trying to justify my existence? to understand the trap of follow your passion. We have to go deeper beneath the feel-good slogans and motivational speeches into the architecture of our identity. Because this isn't just a lie we're told by the world, it's a story. We begin telling ourselves the passion narrative appears empowering on the surface. It promises individuality, fulfillment, and even rebellion against conformity. But underneath, it's strangely obedient. Because what it really says is, you are only valuable if you are exceptional, and your exceptionality must be proven through work you love so much, you'd do it for free, but are so good at, others will pay you for it. This is not liberation. It is self-commodification. The moment doing what you love becomes being what you do, you become your own brand. Your worth begins to ride on performance, perception, and productivity. Psychologist Barry Schwartz called it the paradox of choice. When we're told we can be anything, we assume that not being everything is a failure. And when passion becomes a marketable asset, the freedom to choose becomes an obligation to choose correctly. You don't just need to pick a job, you need to pick the right passion, one that pays, one that scales, one that makes you unique enough to stand out in a global arena of curated identities. And so we scroll, we compare, we optimize, we become anxious. We measure our progress not by meaning, but by metrics, likes, followers, client lists, praise, virality. Slowly, passion becomes indistinguishable from performance, from hustle, from burnout disguised as inspiration. But this wasn't always how we saw work or meaning in pre-modern societies. Passion was never the centerpiece of life design. Purpose came from tradition, duty, survival, or spiritual transcendence. Identity was given, not chosen. Your place in the world was stable. If limited, you were a baker's son, a seamstress's daughter, a blacksmith, a farmer. The burden of being special was often reserved for prophets, poets, or madmen. It wasn't until modern capitalism fused with individualism that the inner self became a project to be built, monetized, and constantly upgraded. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre warned that absolute freedom, the idea that we must define our own essence, could lead not to joy, but to dread. Because if your life's meaning depends on your own decisions, then every choice becomes a referendum on your worth, including the choice of passion. And this is where the trap tightens. The more pressure we feel to find the right passion, the more paralyzed we become. The fear of choosing incorrectly keeps us stuck in limbo. We become researchers of ourselves, reading books, taking personality tests, binging podcasts, waiting for the perfect lightning bolt to tell us who we are. But that lightning bolt never comes, because the soul doesn't scream, it whispers. And in the noise of performative culture, we lose the silence in which our true longings speak. Carl Jung understood this well. He believed that the modern person is torn between the demands of the ego and the voice of the self. The ego wants success, admiration, certainty. The self wants wholeness, integration. The ego is concerned with what should I do, but the self asks, who must I become? The problem with the passion narrative is that it addresses only the ego's hunger. It feeds your desire to be someone, to matter. But it rarely asks whether the thing you're chasing actually serves your deeper evolution. You could be wildly successfully and profoundly unwell. You could be following your passion and quietly losing your soul. This is what the philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls achievement subjectivity. In today's culture, we no longer feel oppressed by external forces. we exploit ourselves in the name of freedom. We chase passion not because we are forced to, but because we believe this is what makes us free. And so we hustle ourselves into exhaustion, convinced that burnout is a badge of honor. But here's the truth. When passion becomes a commandment, it is no longer passion, it is compulsion. And when your sense of worth is fused to your work, even joy becomes labor. Even creativity becomes survival. This is the hidden cost of the passion myth. It makes you believe that not knowing, not producing, not scaling, not monetizing is failure. That stillness is laziness. That experimentation is wasteful. That boredom is dangerous. But boredom is where wonder is born, and stillness is where clarity returns. Passion, in its pure form, is not a career plan. It is a pulse, a curiosity, a sense of aliveness. It grows in silence, in play, in moments unmeasured by metrics. And sometimes it hides for years only to return in ways you never expect. But in order to hear it, you must first unhook yourself from the lie that passion is something to be captured, optimized, and sold. Because the deeper truth is this: you are not a brand, you are not a product, you are not a factory for inspiration, you are a being in process, a soul in motion. And your value does not depend on your usefulness. Not everything meaningful needs to be productive. Not everything beautiful needs to be profitable. Not everything you love needs to be your identity. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is just enjoy it. We believed the promise that passion would lead us to freedom, that if we found the one thing we were meant to do, everything else, money, joy, meaning, would follow. But what if the pursuit itself was rigged? What if the lie wasn't in the passion, but in the pressure to turn it into purpose? The consequences are not just personal, they are cultural, they are systemic, they are spiritual. At a psychological level, the obsession with passion creates a cruel paradox. We are encouraged to find something we love deeply, but the moment we do, we're asked to prove it, to monetize it, to justify it. And suddenly, love becomes labor, curiosity becomes strategy, play becomes pressure. Consider the artist who once painted for joy. Now she must manage an online shop, study SEO, produce tutorials, answer DMS, update a portfolio, pitch to galleries. The work she once did to escape the world has become the very source of her exhaustion. Or the writer who once scribbled thoughts into a private notebook. Now he studies engagement metrics, experiments with AI tools, builds a personal brand, fights algorithm decay. His voice, once raw and strange and true, begins to sound like everyone else's: tidy, sellable, safe. This is not the freedom we were promised. This is surveillance disguised as self-expression. We no longer write for ourselves, we write to be noticed. We no longer build for joy, we build for scale. Even our solitude is colonized. Even our rest is optimized. Burnout is no longer the cost of doing too much, it is the inevitable result of measuring yourself against an imaginary ideal of passion-fueled perfection. And yet, we blame ourselves. We think, maybe I chose the wrong passion. Maybe I just didn't try hard enough. Maybe I'm not disciplined, or talented, or deserving. We internalize the failure of a system that told us we would be whole if only we hustled hard enough. But the system was never built for wholeness. It was built for productivity. And the more you identify with your passion, the more vulnerable you become. Because now, every failure is personal. Every setback is a statement about who you are. Lost a client. That's your identity being rejected didn't go viral. That's your soul being ignored, tired of the work you once loved. That's your value evaporating. The psychological weight of this is immense. It leads to anxiety, imposter syndrome, creative paralysis, and depression, not because we've lost our way, but because we were never taught how to separate our being from our doing. Culturally, the follow your passion mantra feeds a dangerous illusion that success is always a matter of personal choice, that if you're not thriving, you must not have chosen well. This individualism erases context, economic inequality, systemic barriers, inherited trauma. It tells the student working 3 jobs to survive that they just haven't found their spark. It tells the single parent with no time for hobbies that they're out of alignment. It turns structural problems into private shame. Worse, it creates a hierarchy of worth based on visibility and monetization. The teacher who quietly changes lives is less admirable than the influencer who sells productivity hacks. The nurse who works night shifts in silence is less fulfilled than the founder raising venture capital for a wellness app. The craftsman who spends decades perfecting his skill is less inspiring than the 23-year-old who turns his side hustle into a TED Talk. When passion becomes a performance, worth becomes a spectacle. We celebrate those who turn their love into leverage, but we ignore the quiet, steady lives lived with care and craft. We forget that devotion, not dopamine, is what gives work its depth. And then there is the spiritual cost. When you tie your sense of purpose to your productivity, you begin to believe that stillness is emptiness, that unless you are chasing, optimizing, building, achieving, you are wasting your life. But the soul does not grow through hustle. The soul grows through depth, through attention, through presence. It grows in the unseen moments, watching a tree shift in the wind, reading a sentence that shatters your illusions, sitting with grief until it softens into wisdom, listening not for applause, but for silence. The spiritual fallout of the passion myth is not just burnout. It is alienation from your inner life. You lose the capacity to wonder, to rest without guilt. You forget how to do things for no reason, how to create without showing anyone, how to enjoy something without turning it into content. In the name of passion, you trade your soul for performance. But passion, in its deepest form, is not about self-fulfillment. It is about self-transcendence. It's not always joyful. It's not always fun. It's often slow, uncomfortable, ordinary. The truest passions don't always sparkle. They simmer. They deepen. They ground you in something larger than yourself. Sometimes they have nothing to do with work. Sometimes your truest passion is not something you do, it's the way you love, the way you listen, the way you show up in a world that teaches you to always be more. And this is the final tragedy of the follow your passion lie. It shrinks the vastness of the human spirit into a career path. It makes you believe that meaning can only be found in what you produce, that worth is something to be proven, that love must be efficient. But life is not a startup. You are not a brand. Your soul is not an algorithm to be hacked. You are allowed to be useless. You are allowed to be slow. You are allowed to love something deeply and never turn it into your job. You are allowed to simply be. Maybe the problem isn't passion itself. Maybe it's the way we've been told to use it as a compass, as currency, as a cage. Maybe passion was never meant to carry the full weight of our identity, income, and sense of purpose all at once. To heal from the false promise we must first reclaim the truth of what passion actually is and what it, isn, single quotes, t. But passion is not a product. It doesn't need to be branded, monetized, or shared to be real. You don't need to turn your art into an Etsy shop, your writing into a newsletter, your love of cooking into a personal chef business. You can do things simply because they light something inside you. In fact, some of the purest forms of passion are those done in secret. The gardener who never posts their roses, the grandfather who carves animals from wood and gives them away, the teenager who scribbles poetry in a notebook no one will ever read. These acts aren't lesser there. Free, in a world where every moment is a potential post, there's something radical about doing things that are unseen. Something sacred about joy that doesn't need an audience. Passion is not your job. It may overlap with your work or it may not. Some people find great satisfaction in aligning their work with what they love. Others don't, and that's okay. Not every baker dreams of opening a bakery. Not every coder dreams of building a startup. Not every lover of books wants to be a writer. You are allowed to separate what you love from how you earn. In fact, for many, trying to turn a passion into a profession kills the very thing they loved. It turns play into pressure, hobby into hustle. What once replenished them now depletes them. Work doesn't have to fulfill you. It just has to support you financially, emotionally, ethically. You can find meaning elsewhere, in friendships, in rituals, in service, in creating for joy. Don't outsource your soul to your salary. Passion is not always pleasant. Sometimes it's hard, boring, repetitive, lonely. The idea that if you love it, it won't feel like work is a lie that sets people up for disappointment. Real passion is often quiet and grueling. It demands patience, discipline, commitment through the unromantic phases. Ask the musician who spends months writing one good verse. Ask the dancer who practices alone for hours with no audience. Ask the activist who keeps showing up even when nothing seems to change. They don't do it because it's always fun, they do it because it matters. Passion is less about feeling good and more about feeling called. Not in the spiritual savior sense, but in the bone deep. I can't not do this kind of way. So how do we begin to relate to passion in a healthier, deeper, more human way? We start by untangling it from the myth of finding your one true purpose. This idea that you must discover a single life-defining passion is a setup for constant dissatisfaction. People change. You will not be the same person at 20, 35, or 60. Your interests will evolve. Your capacity will shift. Your values will grow. Instead of asking, "What's my passion?" ask, "What feels alive in me right now? What am I curious about? What can I lose myself in? What's worth doing even when no one notices?" These questions leave room for fluidity. They make space for seasons. They allow for mystery, but passion isn't a destination. It's a relationship. And like any relationship, it changes. Over time, sometimes it's obsessive, fiery, and urgent. Other times, it's slow, grounding, and quiet. Sometimes it disappears altogether on, that too is normal. Let it hibernate. It will return when it's ready. We must also make peace with being average at what we love. Not every pianist becomes a concert performer. Not every painter ends up in a gallery. Not every thinker writes a best-selling book. That doesn't make your passion any less valid. Greatness is not the price of admission for joy. You don't have to be the best to be fulfilled. You don't have to win for something to be worthwhile. The world needs fewer perfect careers and more honest lives. It needs people who choose curiosity over certainty, people who create without an agenda, people who rest without guilt, people who love their passions, not because they're useful, but because they make them feel human. So build a relationship with your passion that honors your limits, that gives you room to fail, to quit, to return, that allows for detours and dead ends and new beginnings, that doesn't shame you when you grow out of what once defined you. And above all, build a relationship with yourself that isn't dependent on what you do. You are not your work. You are not your audience. You are not your productivity. You are not your passion. You are the stillness beneath it, the awareness that watches, the being that remains when everything else changes. Passion is beautiful, but it is not enough. It cannot save you. It cannot sustain you. It cannot hold you through grief or silence or uncertainty. Only you can do that. The you that exists beyond what you produce. The you that breathes and watches and listens. Let your passion serve your soul, not replace it. We live in a world obsessed with direction. Every question echoes the same demand. Where are you going? What's your path? What's your passion? But maybe life was never about movement in a straight line. Maybe it was never about going somewhere. Maybe it's about becoming someone again and again through experience. Curiosity, stillness, grief, joy, and the quiet revolutions of being human, the lie behind. Follow your passion is that it makes us feel we are not whole until we've arrived at some grand, burning purpose, that we are wasting time if we're unsure, that we are lesser if we haven't made our passion our livelihood, that to simply live, to wonder, to work with our hands and hearts is not enough. But what if it is enough? What if you're allowed to love something without turning it into a job? What if your worth isn't tied to the output of your passion, but to your presence with it? What if you could follow not your passion, but your aliveness? Aliveness is quieter. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to justify itself. It shows up in small things. The way your shoulders relax when you paint with no deadline. The way you lose time when helping someone through something difficult. The sense of stillness you feel when walking alone in the early morning light. These moments don't require a strategy. They don't promise fame. They aren't part of a 5-year plan. But they are real. And often, they're more true than anything you could write in a resume or a bio. So instead of chasing a singular passion like a finish line, try this. Be loyal to your curiosity. Protect what brings you peace. Let go of the need to be Focus instead on being authentic. Remember, the deepest parts of you are not marketable. They are not scalable. They are not meant to be optimized. They are sacred, and the point of passion was never to define your worth, but to remind you that you're alive, not when you succeed, not when you're recognized, not when it pays the bills, but right now, in this breath, in this body, in this quiet moment where you remember that who you are is not a brand or a mission. It's a miracle. You don't need to follow your passion. You need to return to yourself. That's where it's always been.